Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, March the 5th, 2025. Last night, Tuesday, there was another Trump performance, which I know not all our viewers and listeners will be particularly enthused with. I can't say I was. His hostility to immigrants is particularly troubling. In the speech, he, according to PBS at least, touted his immigrant crackdown. He seemed to demonize immigrants in much of the speech, and he pressed ahead to reshape America as a place, I guess, without immigrants. There's supposed to be a great deal of frustration within the White House about the pace of deportations. We're not talking about Trump immigration policy today, but we are talking about immigration more broadly and a successful version of it. My guest today is Meenakshi Ahamed. She has a really interesting new book out, Indian Genius, The Meteoric Rise of Indians in America. It's a book about successful Indians and a successful group, mostly of immigrants to America, Indians, and she's joining us from New York today. Meena, congratulations on the new book. I know you didn't watch the whole speech and it may not be quite your thing, but what did you make of it in terms of the way in which Trump appeared to demonize immigrants?
Thank you for having me on your show, Andrew. And I so appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about this subject because ever since President Trump took office the second time around, particularly, he's gone out of his way to make immigration a central focus of his attention, and he has really, as you said, gone out of his way to demonize immigrants. So my book, in a sense, is a bit of a counter narrative to his portrayal of immigrants. Look, I find this particularly appalling, given that two of Trump's wives were immigrants, and Cy Vance's wife's family is Indian American. So, we are a country where I don't think, unless you're Native American, every single person in this country, whether they're first generation, second generation, they can, or maybe their great grandfather or great great grandfather, but every single person in this country has someone in their family that came from somewhere. It is the connective tissue that binds us. That is something that should actually be something that brings us together. And each and every community that's come to this country, whether it's the Irish Americans, the German Americans, the East Europeans, or the Jewish Americans, everyone has contributed in some way to building this country. So my book is about the Indians and the contributions they've made. But I hope that there'll be other people will write books about Irish geniuses and the Jewish geniuses. I mean, there are so many brilliant people who've contributed so much. But for Trump to pick a small, tiny fraction of a few people that have committed crimes and to build it into this dreadful thing, frankly, is a disservice to the efforts of all the communities that have come here wave upon wave and built this country into what it is today.
Tell me about yourself. You are also, in a sense, an immigrant. You were born in Calcutta, India. You divide your time between New York and Los Angeles. How do you think of yourself as an immigrant? Why did you come to this country originally?
I came to study like a lot of other people, and I've described this in my book. There was a push and a pull. There were people in India, especially in the medical and community and the STEM fields, who felt that they could not get at the higher level of education. They would really they couldn't get the resources and the education that they were looking for, and they were super smart, and some of them wanted to come to this country to develop themselves further. But there was also a pull from here. There was a need. Let's not forget that when President Johnson passed the Medicare Act in 1965, 20 million Americans all of a sudden had access to health care. It was the same time that the Vietnam War was happening, and a whole lot of medical people were being sent off to the war. And there was a massive shortage of medical personnel in this country, and they needed doctors. It was the same time when the AMA suggested that medical schools take fewer medical students. So there was a big shortage, and they had to go, all the hospitals had to take care of all these people, and they had to go looking for doctors overseas. And so they went to English speaking countries because Europeans were no longer coming in. And so they went to the Philippines, and I've described this in my book. It's Deepak Chopra, who came in 1965. He was an endocrinologist, and Abraham Verghese, who you may know. They said that when they walked into their residencies, every single person they came across was a foreigner. There were Filipinos, there were Koreans, there were Latin Americans, but there were almost no Americans, particularly in the underserved areas, if in the inner city hospitals, places like Tennessee, in the rural areas. 20% of this country is in the rural areas, but they only have 10% of the physicians. And in places where the people are poor, or where people are 75% of them are not white, or the per capita income is under 15,000, 40% of those physicians are foreign trained. And the reason is that, someone who graduates from Harvard Medical School or Columbia Medical School, they don't want to go work in the inner city. It's not financially remunerative for them. So foreign trained doctors who come in, they're willing to go do that.
Yeah, and your book also features other very prominent Indian-born doctors, Vivek Murthy, who was the former US Surgeon General, and Atul Gawande, another very well-known American surgeon, or Indian-American surgeon and writer. Meena, there was a very interesting Pew report, I know you refer to it in your book, about the success of Indians in the United States. Their average income apparently in 2022 is $145,000, which is astonishing. One of the things that always occurs to me about India is obviously an enormous country, a very complicated country. It's also a country divided by class or caste. Are most of the Indians who come to the United States, are they mostly from the upper class or caste, or are they people who are self-made in America mostly?
That's a fantastic question, Andrew, and very insightful one. You are absolutely right. They certainly, the ones who came when 1965, when the immigration laws got loosened, and when this need for Indian doctors and need for Indian engineers took place, yes, almost all of those Indians that came from 1965, I would say right up through 2000, 2010, almost everyone you're going to meet is upper caste. And the reason is that upper caste Indians are the ones that had access to education in India. They're the ones who had the resources, and they're the ones who had the connections. Look, when I came to this country, the Indian government had a rule, because they were short on foreign exchange in those days. I mean, the 60s, India was not a rich country. It was very different than it is today. And we were only allowed to go out with $8. Doesn't matter if your family had more money. You were only allowed to exchange $8 and leave. And that was true for everybody. So, there's a sort of what you call the $8 club. Some of my Silicon Valley people that I interviewed, they're all members of that $8 club. They may be millionaires today. I'm not. Those guys, they may be millionaires today, but they started out with $8. And so you had to have either a connection here, scholarships here, resources, people you knew who could provide you with some sort of backup. And so, those were usually the elite or upper caste people.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read Isabel Wilkerson's book on caste or see
Yeah.
the movie, she presents the caste system in India as actually being rather similar to the racial inequalities of America. Do you think there's any truth to that in your view?
Cost is so complicated. I would say yes and no. And today, in many ways, if you look at India, the richest man in India, Mukesh Ambani, does not come from the upper caste. But I think that, and the prime minister, this is the first prime minister, Prime Minister Modi, who does not come from the upper caste. Every other prime minister did, but not this one. So there's a change that's taken place in India, remarkable change. But also, I think class and money has overtaken caste in India as well. The other thing to remember that India has a very strong affirmative action program where 40 to 50% uh, of seats in universities, schools, government jobs, etc., are all reserved for the backward classes and lower castes. That's a phenomenal amount. Now, there were actually strikes and suicides and all kinds of repercussions against this, particularly in medical schools and in schools that were engineering schools. But it stayed, and so there's going to be a whole new generation that's going to come up, and that is coming up that elevates the people who were deprived before. And I think you're going to see that reflected in the people coming into this country.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Modi, of course, who is a very controversial figure. Some people compare him with Trump, suggest they're very much cut from the same cloth. You noted that earlier India has changed dramatically from the 1960s and 70s when it was a more quote unquote socialist or third way state. Has that changed the nature of the immigrant? Are the Indians now coming from Modi's India different from the Indians who came from Indira Gandhi's India?
I do think they're very different because the first generation of Indians that came to Silicon Valley and the doctors, um, in a sense, they were my generation. I suppose I'm 70 years old. The generation was, you had to make do with very little because you didn't have any support systems here. So, the people who I've mentioned in my book, they all came with this sort of $8 thing, and it was really make it or break it. And you had to rely on yourself, and you had no choice, and so you worked extremely hard, and you and they were sort of in Silicon Valley. I noticed there were a lot more inventors and founders in that generation. They weren't getting promoted within the companies, so they were inventing things and then creating their own companies.
Yeah, one of the people we've actually had on the show a few years ago was Vinod Khosla, one of Silicon Valley's leading technologists and investors. Satya Nadella, of course, is the CEO of Microsoft. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google. Indian Americans have had a remarkable amount of success within Silicon Valley. It's quite astonishing, isn't it?
Yeah, but Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella, they're the second lot. They don't come from that old.
Okay, so Vinod is the elder generation.
I know there's the elder generation, and he has that drive, and that I'm not saying that Sundar and Satya don't. They have a different sort of drive, but let's not forget that Satya Nadella's father. And his wife's father, they worked in the prime minister's office, very privileged background, and came from the elite of the elite in India. Um, he 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 came over at a much later stage. He came as part of the tech generation. And India had started to change by then. India had emerged as India had just begun to, when they were coming out, India had just begun to emerge as a global power because they had undertaken economic reforms. And one of the reasons they began to be taken seriously in the world was that they had started to emerge as a global power and they had economically started to grow.
Yeah, I would actually think, of course, you're right about different generations, although Nadella is such a polished operator, such a smart man on so many different levels, so well respected. And I think Pichai is the same. I mean, they're both reinventing, or certainly Nadella reinvented Microsoft, and Pichai is in the process of reinventing Google. Is Khosla, though, a sort of the model, if you like, for the guy who came to India with $6 or $8 and ended up as a billionaire?
Yes, definitely. I think Vinod Khosla, in many ways, epitomizes, someone who was very determined, who came from a modest military background, who had no resources but himself. I mean, just look at the way he got into Stanford. I mean, he was determined to go to Stanford. He waited until there was an opening, something opened up. He didn't get in right away. And the minute it did, he made sure that he was the one who got the.
Right. And according to Forbes from this year, he's worth now $8.1 billion, which is
he has this, he's a real visionary.
Although he's also controversial. I mean, I know he's a Democrat, but he was in the news a few years ago because of his behavior with ownership of a beach in Silicon Valley. So these people aren't angels, are they?
No. I mean, it's all in my book. So I've Vinod is probably one of the more interesting chapters because I've gone, listen, this is a person who, he says he read this book by Sam Harris, about lying, and he says he never lies, and if someone brings him a gift and he doesn't like it, he tells his assistant, I'm not going to lie and say I love your gift. He just says, send them a note saying it's interesting. He's not a warm.
Did you ask him about the beach in the conversation?
We just touched on it peripherally. There were so many other things I was really interested in knowing about because my book is about success, and it's about how did these people become so successful? What were the obstacles that they came across? How did they overcome them? And what inspired them?
So what are the lessons? I mean, if Trump was listening, he would probably say, who knows what he would say, but my guess is he would say, well, I've got nothing against Indians. Some of my best friends are Indians. I respect Vinod and Nadella and all the others. I wish more immigrants were like that. I don't want to turn this into another Trump conversation, but what are the lessons? Because not all immigrant communities are as successful as the Indians, although maybe that, Meena, is the wrong way of thinking about it.
Look, whenever you have a critical mass, and now there's a critical mass of Indians, Indians are the fastest growing minority in immigrant group in the US now, and they're just under 5 million. So whenever you have a critical mass, you're going to have the people who either haven't done well or the bad players. So I don't want to gloss over it, but yes, the Indians have.
But they've done well. I mean, you're not just relativizing this. I mean, compared to almost any other immigrant community, I mean, there may be some others from Southeast Asia, but Indians do remarkably well.
What's also remarkable is that they've done it in one generation. What they've done is they've done it. Satya Nadella and Sundar Pichai came here as adults, and they're running Fortune 500 companies.
Well, it's more than Fortune. I mean, they're running 2 of the 5 or 6 most valuable companies in the world.
Yeah. And Indra Nooyi also came here as an adult. So all these people came here as adults. And, and then there's this group like Vivek Murthy, who you mentioned, the Surgeon General, Neil Katyal, and people like that who were born in this country or raised in this country, who are the new generation. And who are very, very committed. Ro Khanna, the congressman.
Yeah, I mean, you've got politicians, Khanna and
Nikki Haley.
So there are. It is an interesting cross section, but you're avoiding the question. What what does this tell us? I mean, I don't want to get into racial theories, of course, but is there something in the water, in the food, in the transportation? What is it about Indians that make them so successful?
So, I think there's a difference with the older generation. There is something in India called jugad. I almost titled the book that, but it translates into, it's not quite genius, but uh, it's an ability to be able to create something out of nothing. And it's sort of like in India, um, it's a determination that you have, um, to be able to just create something out of, a bus will come and it won't stop at the bus stop, it'll stop 2 feet away. The most enterprising people are the one who are going to be able to get on that bus. And a lot of people who I interviewed mentioned that word. We have jugad. Um, Failure
I
is
mean,
not.
the Jews call it chutzpah
Yeah, I mean,
in
failure was
Yiddish, anyway. Yeah. So it's
when
using a situation and being able to adapt to situations. I mean, India, of course, I've been there a few times. It's a wonderful place, but it's quite anarchic. I mean, you've really got to look after yourself,
you
don't
have to look after yourself. And when you live in a country with 1.2 billion people, you have to compete for everything from a place in your nursery school to your electricity connection to your gas connection, to getting your phone or your car. I mean, it's you have to stand in line for everything, and you want to be able to get ahead. People in India are always looking to see how they can get past the other person. uh, you know
you? Is that
they-
attractive? Some people might think that that's a sort of almost a critique of neoliberalism in America. That's the culture of America where people are so competitive. Is that something to be celebrated about India? Do you think?
well, they are. Well, I think the thing is, what softens that whole aspect is this kind of devotion to your family,
Yeah.
and this sort of collective. There's a sense of, there is a kindness within the community, which I think uh, community links are very strong in India. And here, because of the extreme mobility of people and the nuclear family being so important and the emphasis on the individual, that gets lost a little bit. In India, everything is collective. Success is collective. If you fail, it's a failure on the whole family and the community. If you succeed, it's reflective of the whole family and the community.
Does this get washed out after 3 or 4? I mean, most of the people you've written about are either first or second generation immigrants. Do you think it will get washed out like so many other migrant
Yeah, I
communities
mean,
after 3 or 4 generations?
that's an interesting question, and I think the jury's out. We'll have to wait and see. If you let's just look at Usha Vance. Um, you know, uh,
JD Vance is, in
right.
my sense, is rather much suffering wife, although who knows whether she's enjoying herself.
But
Hard to tell.
JD is the one who earlier, before he sort of downplayed his immigrant wife, he kept talking about, how helpful her family was and how they couldn't have done it without the family, raising the children with the two busy careers. So it's very, I mean, she was a high-powered lawyer and also at Yale Law School, but clearly it was compared to his family, hers was a very much a family
Yeah,
enterprise.
I mean, he made his name initially on, if not trashing his family, certainly writing about it. The female element is also really important. There is, of course, Kamala Harris, who's probably the most famous Indian or half Indian American, certainly politician or figure, certainly a female. And then, of course, Nikki Haley, who had the audacity to run against Trump. You're, goes without saying, Meena, you're a woman too. The gendered element is quite striking, isn't it, in terms of Indian genius, in terms of, especially given, as you've suggested, it's quite a traditional community on one level. Women seem to have, in some ways, had the same amount of success as men, certainly at the university and studying and in careers.
Well, education is emphasized and pushed between men and women fairly equally in the upper classes. I don't think in India I'm not talking about here. In India, that's not necessarily true in the rural areas. But certainly amongst the upper classes, it's considered very, very important. And I see that there's a big change in the urban areas. I mean, I was talking to a bus driver who was telling me that, he was saving money so his daughter could go to private school private school because he said the government schools weren't good enough and the teachers weren't there half the time, et cetera, et cetera. And he says her only chance was to send his daughter to a private school, and that was for a female. So attitudes are changing there as well. But we shall see how it gets reflected. But here, I think it's very equal.
What about the Harris phenomenon? Of course, Trump made the remark about her shifting from being Indian to black, which was quite controversial. Do you think there's a lot of Indian in Kamala Harris? Did you note it? Did you have a great deal of pride when she ran for president?
I think Kamala Harris was raised by an Indian mother, by a single mother who was Indian. She went for family vacations to India. So it seems pretty obvious that she has some cultural connections to India that are sentimental and strong. But it seems to me that her entire political identity is Black American, and it always has been. And her mother promoted that from what she says. I can only go by what she says, and so I think that that's one is her public and political identity, and she went to Howard. That's another reinforce. One of the reasons some people ask me why isn't she in your book, and I said she doesn't identify as Indian.
Yeah, other people do. There seems to be quite an affinity between African Americans and Indians. I have one or two friends who have parents of both backgrounds. Is that fair? I mean, Kamala's father was from the West Indies rather than African American. But are there close connections between Indians and other immigrant communities or other minority communities like the African American community?
It's hard for me personally to judge. I have one daughter who's married to someone who's half Irish and half Jewish, and I have another daughter who's married to an African American. So,
Wow. Well, you brought them up well, Meena.
well, I mean, yeah, we brought them up to look for good people, not to look for
What
race.
about the political side? I mentioned Nikki Haley, who is a conservative, although perhaps certainly a very different kind of conservative from the MAGA crowd. She had the audacity to run against Trump. And then, of course, there's Ro Khanna, who you mentioned earlier, who's a Democrat and who's quite far on the left. Do Indians skew to a political
Oh, yes. I mean,
party?
so yes. So, Indians traditionally voted 75% Democrat consistently until this last election. And in this last election,
Wow.
yeah, so they were reliably Democrat. Um, and in this last election, they have slid 10%. There was a 10%, I believe, slide towards the Republicans, particularly amongst young men.
What does that tell us?
That tells us that young men were following the national trend.
Yeah, probably no different from young white men or young African American
Yeah,
men.
and these were people who were born here. So, whereas the older generation that has, come from India has sort of stayed reliably Democrat. But the younger crowd tends to vote more like, they're pretty much under the influence of what their other contemporaries are doing.
Is there a
And
horror?
by the way, I do know several Indians who did come from India, but who are very successful business people who sadly voted with their pocketbook and thought that Trump was better for taxes.
Are there some Indians who are disappointed, perhaps even more than that, with Trump's rejection of internationalism? I'm not sure if he has any strong feelings. I mean, he seems to be a friend and admirer of Modi, but this shift away from internationalism towards
Well,
tariffs and hostility to
are
other
you
countries.
asking me about people here or people in
No,
India?
Indian Americans. I mean, for your book, you interviewed what you call Indian geniuses, many from, Fareed
Sorry.
Zakaria, for example,
Yeah.
who
But
is
but
again
I
quite
finished my book.
publicly critical of Trump.
Yeah, I finished my book before the election, so I wasn't able to ask them about Trump. Um, so I would, this is just something that's happened in the last, since November, and my book uh, actually came out in India December, so it was already my manuscript was finished by.
So what are finally, Mina, what are the lessons we can learn in all seriousness? Even Trump is open, he says, at least, to the idea of immigration. He just wants, in his
Trump.
rather troubling language, a better quality of immigrant. What can we learn from the Indian experience in America in terms of having a more perhaps successful or uncontroversial immigration policy?
Well, see, Trump has just said that you can buy for 5 million, you can
Yeah.
buy a gold card. Now, who's going to buy a 5 million gold card? It's not going to be the most brilliant person coming out of the Indian Institute of Technology or the most brilliant doctor, because they're still young. They're not going to have the 5 million. I mean, if you want to get the next Atul Gawande or the next Siddharth Mukherjee, who's going to find the cure for cancer, that's not going to happen on that 5 million card, because you need to attract young minds who are going to come. And then, his other idea of, if someone is studying here in grad school and they're smart, you should be able to keep them here. That's a better idea. He hasn't sort of developed any mechanics for it, however. But the 5 million card, those are just people who are business people, I don't know, drug people who can't get in any other way.
So you're suggesting maybe then, rather than the $5 million card, it should be the $8 card. We need people like Vinod Khosla to come here with $8 in their pocket
Well,
and figure out a way to get into Stanford and then become multi-billionaire venture capitalists.
the US already has a program. They have the H-1B program. The people who come in on excellence, the visa, the H-1B visa, which is actually remarkably 75% of those visas go to Indians. Only less than 15%.
75% of those visas go to Indians.
It is true, and less than 15%, I think, go to the Chinese. But it's a remarkable number that go to the Indians. It's been when I was in India, everyone kept asking me, what is Trump going to do to the H-1B? But the H-1B is what brings in skilled people to this country.
Well, Meenakshi Ahamed, the author of Indian Genius, The Meteoric Rise of Indians in America, really important and inspiring story. Many remarkable individuals, Fareed Zakaria, Ro Khanna, Nikki Haley, many others in the book. Congratulations on the book, Meena, and continue to do your business.
Thank you.
Indian Genius. We need you in America. Thank you so much.